A century-old sentence hung over the serialized novel, and its demise was threatened not only by the Ryan-C Amendment of 1850, which imposed a punishing tax on newspapers that published these feuilletons, but also by the general opinion among God-fearing people that feuilletons were the ruin of families. They corrupted the young, drove adults to communism, and undermined the throne and the altar. See, for example, the two-volume Etudes critiques sur le feuilleton roman, almost 1,000 pages that Alfred Nedman devoted in 1845 to this devilish literature. And yet it is only through the serialized novel that, from early childhood, we learn about classic narrative devices. Here they appear in their purest form, often brazenly, but with an overwhelming mythopoeic energy. And so I would like to consider not a particular book, but a particular genre, the feuilleton, and a specific device, anagnorisis, or recognition. If it were necessary to remind you, as I have just done, that the feuilleton makes use of timeless narrative devices, then we would cite Aristotle, Poetics, section 1452 AB. Anagnorisis is the change from ignorance to knowledge, and in particular the recognition of one person by another, as when a character unexpectedly discovers, by another person's revealing it, or by discovering a necklace or a scar, that someone else is his father or son, or worse still, as when Oedipus realizes that Jocasta, the woman he has married, is his mother. One reacts to anagnorisis either with a simple willingness to play the narrator's game or in accordance with the rules of narrative. In the second case, some think the effect is in danger of being lost, but that is not correct, and to prove this I will make a few observations about narrative before turning swiftly to look at the miracles of anagnorisis at first hand. A double anagnorisis must take not only the character but also the reader unawares. This surprise may have been prepared through hints and suspicions, or it may arrive quite unexpectedly even for the reader, and the way these subtle, almost imperceptible clues or sudden coups de théâtre are handled depends on the skill of the narrator. A simple anagnorisis, on the other hand, occurs when a character is taken completely by surprise at a certain revelation, but the reader already knows what is going on. Typical of this category is the multiple unmasking of Monte Cristo to his enemies, which the reader has been eagerly awaiting since halfway through the book. In a double anagnorisis, the reader identifies with the character, sharing his joy and suffering as well as his surprises. But in simple anagnorisis, the reader projects his own frustrations or hopes of revenge onto the character, whose secret he already knows or can guess, and anticipates the turn of events. In other words, the reader would like to deal with his enemies, his boss, or the woman who has walked out on him in the same way that Monte Cristo does. You used to despise me? Well then, now I shall tell you who I really am. And he licks his lips, waiting for the final moment to arrive. A useful element for the successful outcome of an anagnorisis is disguise. By removing his mask, the person disguised increases the other character's surprise. And the reader either shares that surprise or, having seen through the disguise, enjoys the surprise of the unsuspecting characters. For the two types of anagnorisis there are then two sorts of degeneration, when the recognition is redundant or pointless. Revelation is, in fact, a currency to be spent thriftily and should provide the clue to a respectable plot. The case of Monte Cristo, who reveals his identity many times and, in turn, gradually learns of the plot in which he has been victim, is a rare and masterly case of revelation that, though used numerous times, is no less satisfying for it. In the popular feuilleton, however, since revelation sells well, it is repeated to the point of excess, thus losing all dramatic power and acquiring a purely consoling function, in the sense that it provides a drug that the reader comes to depend on and cannot do without. The overuse of this device reaches extreme proportions when the revelation is obviously completely pointless in terms of plot development, and the novel becomes stuffed with it purely for publicity purposes, so that it can be promoted as the ideal serial novel and worth every penny. A patent example of pointless moments of anagnorisis, one after the other, is Ponson du Tourel's Le Forgeron de la Cowardieu. Note that the pointless anagnorises in the following list are those marked with an asterisk, and, as you will see, they are in the majority.
This is the story. Dom Jérôme reveals who he is to Jean. Dom Jérôme reveals who he is to Mazars. The Comtesse de Mazars, from Valognes's description, recognizes Jean as the sister of Aurore. From the portrait in the small box left to her by her mother, Aurore recognizes Jean as her sister. Aurore, while reading her mother's letter, recognizes old Benjamin as Fritz. Lucien learns from Aurore that Jean is her sister, and that his mother killed their mother. Raoul de la Morlier realizes that César is the son of Blazot and that his temptress is the Comtesse de Mazars. Lucien, after wounding Morlier in a duel, discovers under his shirt a medallion with the portrait of Gretchen. The gypsy girl realizes from a medallion found in Polydie's hand that Aurore is free. Bibi recognizes Jean and Aurore as being the aristocrats described by the gypsy girl. Paul, alias the Chevalier des Mazars, having seen the medallion of Gretchen that Bibi shows him after having received it from the gypsy girl who received it from Polite, recognizes. This is the story. Dom Jérôme reveals who he is to Jean. Dom Jérôme reveals who he is to Mazars. The Comtesse de Mazars, from Valognes's description, recognizes Jean as the sister of Aurore. From the portrait in the small box left to her by her mother, Aurore recognizes Jean as her sister. Aurore, while reading her mother's letter, recognizes old Benjamin as Fritz. Lucien learns from Aurore that Jean is her sister, and that his mother killed their mother. Raoul de la Morlier realizes that César is the son of Blazot and that his temptress is the Comtesse de Mazars. Lucien, after wounding Morlier in a duel, discovers under his shirt a medallion with the portrait of Gretchen. The gypsy girl realizes from a medallion found in Polly's hand that Aurore is free. Bibi recognizes Jean and Aurore as being the aristocrats described by the gypsy girl. Paul alias the Chevalier des Mazars, having seen the medallion of Gretchen that Bibi shows him after having received it from the gypsy girl who received it from Polite, recognizes that the aristocrat he should be arresting is his daughter Aurore. Bibi reveals to Paul that his daughter has been arrested in place of Jean. Bibi, who has escaped, learns that the girl saved from the guillotine is Aurore. Bibi discovers that his fellow stagecoach passenger is Dagobert. Dagobert learns from Bibi that Aurore and Jean are in Paris and that Aurore is in prison. Polite recognizes Dagobert as the man at the Tuileries who saved his life. Dagobert recognizes the gypsy girl who had once foretold his fortune. Dagobert's doctor realizes that César is the son of Blaizotte and that his temptress is the Comtesse des Mazars. Lucien, after wounding Morlier in a duel, discovers under his shirt a medallion with the portrait of Gretchen. The gypsy girl realizes from a medallion found in Polly's hand that Aurore is free. Bibi recognizes Jean and Aurore as being the aristocrats described by the gypsy girl. Paul alias the Chevalier des Mazars, having seen the medallion of Gretchen that Bibi shows him after having received it from the gypsy girl who received it from Polite, recognizes that the aristocrat he should be arresting is his daughter Aurore. Bibi reveals to Paul that his daughter has been arrested in place of Jean. Bibi, who has escaped, learns that the girl saved from the guillotine is Aurore. Bibi discovers that his fellow stagecoach passenger is Dagobert. Dagobert learns from Bibi that Aurore and Jean are in Paris and that Aurore is in prison. Polite recognizes Dagobert as the man at the Tuileries who saved his life. Dagobert recognizes the gypsy girl who had once foretold his fortune. Dagobert's doctor realizes that the German doctor who arrives unexpectedly, sent by the Masques Rouges, is his old master and he recognizes him to be his pupil and Polite to be the young man whom he had just saved on the road. Years later, Polite recognizes a stranger who comes up to talk to him as Bibi. Both recognize the gypsy girl, and Zoe to be her assistant. Benedict comes across and recognizes Bibi. Paul, who has been mad for years, regains his sanity and recognizes Benedict and Bibi. The old hermit is recognized as Dom Jérôme. The Chevalier des Mazars learns that the aristocrat he should be arresting is his daughter Aurore. Bibi reveals to Paul that his daughter has been arrested in place of Jean. Bibi, who has escaped, learns that the girl saved from the guillotine is Aurore. Bibi discovers that his fellow stagecoach passenger is Dagobert. Dagobert learns from Bibi that Aurore and Jean are in Paris and that Aurore is in prison. Polite recognizes Dagobert as the man at the Tuileries who saved his life. Dagobert recognizes the gypsy girl who had once foretold his fortune. Dagobert's doctor realizes that the German doctor who arrives unexpectedly, sent by the Masques Rouges, is his old master and he recognizes him to be his pupil and Polite to be the young man whom he had just saved on the road. Years later, Polite recognizes a stranger who comes up to talk to him as Bibi. Both recognize the gypsy girl, and Zoe to be her assistant. Benedict comes across and recognizes Bibi. Paul, who has been mad for years, regains his sanity and recognizes Benedict and Bibi. The old hermit is recognized as Dom Jérôme. The Chevalier des Mazars learns from Dom Jérôme that his daughter is alive. The gypsy girl discovers that her manservant is none other than Bibi. The Republican, lured into a trap, realizes that an attractive German lady was the young girl whose parents he had sent to the guillotine. Her identity was revealed to the reader 2 pages earlier. The gypsy girl, condemned by the gypsies, recognizes Lucien, Dagobert, Aurore, and Jean as those who have trapped and ruined her.
That the German doctor who arrives unexpectedly, sent by the Masques Rouges, is his old master and he recognizes him to be his pupil and Polite to be the young man whom he had just saved on the road. Years later, Polite recognizes a stranger who comes up to talk to him as Bibi. Both recognize the gypsy girl, and Zoe to be her assistant. Benedict comes across and recognizes Bibi. Paul, who has been mad for years, regains his sanity and recognizes Benedict and Bibi. The old hermit is recognized as Dom Jérôme. The Chevalier des Mazars learns from Dom Jérôme that his daughter is alive. The gypsy girl discovers that her manservant is none other than Bibi. The Republican, lured into a trap, realizes that an attractive German lady was the young girl whose parents he had sent to the guillotine. Her identity was revealed to the reader 2 pages earlier. The gypsy girl, condemned by the gypsies, recognizes Lucien, Dagobert, Aurore, and Jean as those who have trapped and ruined her. It does not matter whether those who have, fortunately, not read Le Forgeron de la Cour du Have managed to make head or tail of this torrent of anagnorisis involving characters they know nothing about. It is all the better for them to remain in a state of confusion, since this novel, in comparison to Feuilleton classics, is like a film that, to attract the last tango in Paris audience, offers its spectators 120 minutes of uninterrupted rear penetration between 100 patients in a psychiatric hospital. Which is exactly what Sade did in the 120 Days of Sodom, pushing down the accelerator pedal for hundreds of pages, whereas Dante limited himself to writing, "He kissed my mouth, trembling all over." Ponson du Tourel's recognitions are pointless, apart from being exaggeratedly redundant, because the reader already knows all about his characters. But for the benefit of readers who are easy to please, a touch of sadism is brought into play. The characters in the novel play the part of village idiots. They are the last to understand what the readers and the other characters in the story have understood perfectly well. Village idiot anagnorisis is divided into anagnorisis of real idiots and falsely accused idiots. We have a real idiot when the elements of plot, details, facts, confidential information, and unambiguous signs all point toward the anagnorisis, and the character alone remains ignorant. In other words, the plot has provided both him and the reader with the means of resolving the enigma, and the fact that he has failed to do so is inexplicable. The perfect example of the real idiot, used critically by authors, is the detective story in which the policeman offers a sharp contrast to the detective, who gains knowledge at the same rate that the reader does. But there are cases in which the idiot is falsely accused because the events themselves are of no help to him, and what makes the reader aware of what is happening is popular plot tradition. For example, the reader knows, through narrative tradition, that character X must be the child of character Y, but Y cannot know this, since he has not read serial fiction. A typical case is that of Rodolphe of Gerolstein in Les Mystères de Paris. Rodolphe has met La Goualeuse, otherwise known as Fleur de Marie, a sweet, defenseless prostitute, and as soon as we are told that his daughter, whom he had had with Sarah McGregor, was taken away from him when she was very young, we immediately guess that Fleur de Marie can only be his daughter. But why should Rodolphe imagine he is the father of a young girl he comes across by chance in a sordid tavern? He will find out, quite rightly, only at the end. But Eugene Sue knows we will already suspect something, and reveals the answer at the end of the first installment. This is a typical case of subjection of the plot to the rules of literary tradition and commercial distribution. Literary tradition ensures that the reader already knows what is the most probable solution, whereas the weekly distribution of the feuilleton, with a story that continues for an endless number of installments, requires that the reader not be kept in suspense for too long, for fear of losing track of the story. Sue is therefore obliged to close that question so that he can open others without overburdening the reader's memory and capacity for suspense. In narrative terms, he commits one suicide while keeping his best card for the second round. But the suicide occurred as soon as he chose to move according to obvious narrative solutions. The popular novel cannot be complex, not even in the invention of plot. There is a last device in the category of pointless anagnorisis, the topos of the false stranger. At the beginning of a chapter, the popular novel often introduces a mysterious character who is unfamiliar to the readers. But a little further into the action they are told, the stranger, whom the reader will have recognized as our X. Here again we have a feeble narrative expedient through which the narrator introduces once again, in a cheap way, the pleasure of revelation. Note here that the anagnorisis is not directed at the character. The stranger knows perfectly well who he is, and generally appears in a dark alleyway, or in a private room, without the others having yet seen him. And if the reader is familiar with feuilletons, he understands straightaway that the stranger is a false stranger and can generally guess immediately who he is. But the author insists, nevertheless, on trying to make him play the role of village idiot, and perhaps with some readers he succeeds. Although, from the point of view of plot style, these cheap devices constitute narrative padding, from the point of view of psychological enjoyment and success they work wonderfully. The laziness of readers demands that they be blandished with mysteries they have already solved or can solve easily. Having reached this point, we might indeed ask whether, resorting to such well-worn ploys, the anagnorisis found in the feuilleton still has the narrative power that it once had. Well, yes. A friend of mine used to say, when I see a flag fluttering in a film, I start to cry, and it doesn't matter whose country it belongs to. Someone wrote, in a review of the film Love Story, that you need a heart of stone not to burst out laughing at Oliver and Jenny's situation. Wrong. Even with a heart of stone, there will still be a tear in our eyes. There is a chemistry of passions, and when narrative ploys are designed to make us cry, then they always do make us cry, and the most cynical snob can at most pretend to scratch his nose to dry away a furtive tear. We can watch Stagecoach, or even one of its more slapdash remakes, countless times, and yet, when the 6th Cavalry arrives with the sound of the bugle, charging with sabers drawn to devastate Geronimo's mob on the verge of victory, even the most perverse heart pulses away under a fine lawn shirt. So let us freely abandon ourselves to the pleasure and excitement of anagnorisis, even if we already know who has to recognize whom, and let us marvel aghast at the many techniques with which this narrative archetype continues to reappear throughout the history of the feuilleton. Oh, said Milady, rising to her feet, I defy you to find the court which pronounced the infamous sentence against me. I defy you to find he who carried it out. Silence, said a voice. It is for me to reply to that. And the man in the red cloak came forward in his turn. What man is that? What man is that? Cried Milady, overcome by terror, her hair falling loose and rising above her livid countenance as if it were alive. Who are you then? Cried all the witnesses of this scene. Ask that woman, said the man in the red cloak, for you may plainly see she knows me. The executioner of Lille, the executioner of Lille, cried Milady, a prey to insensate terror, and clinging to the wall to avoid falling. And this man who for 30 years had bowed his head before André, stood up to his full height and, indicating the corpse of the father to the degenerate son, then the doorway and the man who had remained on the threshold, he said, Monsieur Vicomte, your father murdered your mother's first husband, then cast your elder brother into the sea. But this brother is not dead, here he is. And he pointed to Armand, while André stepped back, terrified. Your father, Bastien continued, repented at the last minute and has restored to your brother the inheritance he had stolen from him and had sought to leave to you. This is no longer your house, but that of Comte Armand de Kergez. Be gone. Armand had spoken as master, and Andre, perhaps for the first time in his life, obeyed. He moved slowly like a wounded tiger that retires backward and, as it retires, still menaces. Having reached the doorway, glancing back toward the window from where he had watched Paris illuminated by the first rays of dawn, almost as if to hurl at Armand a terrible and supreme challenge, he exclaimed. So alas for both of us, virtuous brother. We shall see who will be the winner. You the philanthropist, I the bandit, you the heavens, I the underworld. Paris shall be our battleground. He left with his head high and an infernal smile on his face and, without shedding a tear, left the house no longer his, like a godless Don Giovanni. He stopped once again and allowed his gaze to wander over those present. The guests listened in silence and their smiles disappeared from their faces. Well, he continued, this thief, this murderer, this torturer of women. I found him this evening, an hour ago. He is here among us. Here he is. And with his hand outstretched, he pointed to the Viscount. While the Viscount leapt onto his seat, the speaker's mask fell off. Armand, the sculptor, someone said. Andre, exclaimed Armand in a thunderous voice. Andre, you recognize me? But at that moment, while the guests sat motionless listening to the abrupt and terrible conclusion to the story, the door opened and a man appeared, dressed in black. Like the old servant who went to surprise Don Giovanni during an orgy to announce his father's death, this man, without any concern for the guests, went straight up to Andre, saying, the general, Count Philippon, your father, who has been ill for some time, is sick and wishes to see you on his deathbed. But the man who had brought the news, catching sight of Armand, who had rushed up from behind Andre to stop him, shouted, good heavens, the living image of my colonel. A man appeared at the doorway of the room where the married couple were to be found. At the sight of him, Count Philippon drew back horrified. The new arrival was a man of around 36, tall in stature and dressed in a long blue uniform decorated with a red stripe, of the kind worn by imperial soldiers during the time of the Restoration. His eyes shone with a dark light that gave his face, pale with anger, an expression of disdain. He took 3 steps toward Philippon, who stepped back in fear, pointed an accusing finger at him, and said, murderer. Murderer, Bastien, murmured Philippon, aghast. Yes, replied the hussar. Yes, I am Bastien, whom you thought you had killed, but who is not dead. Bastien, who an hour later was found by the Cossacks drenched in blood. Bastien, who after 40 years in prison has come to seek amends for the blood of his colonel with which you stained your hands. While Philippon, dumbfounded, continued to move back at that terrible sight, Bastien turned to the countess, saying, Madam, this man, this wretch, is the murderer of your son just as he was the murderer of his father. The countess, who 1 instant earlier had been helpless and mad with grief, threw herself like a tiger upon the killer of her son to rip him to pieces with her claws. Murderer, murderer, she shouted, the gallows await you. I myself shall deliver you to the executioner. But at that very moment, as the villain continued to retreat, the mother felt something moving within her. She let out a cry and stopped, pallid, reeling, broken-hearted. The man she wanted to consign to justice for its vengeance, the man she wanted to drag to the gallows, this wretched vile man was the father of her other child, who was beginning to move about within her. It is she, exclaimed the old man, turning his gaze from Marzia to Virginia. He alone had correctly interpreted the sad cry of the woman who had fainted, and she fell into her habitual stupor, then gradually reviving, as if she had an important confession to make, and a tear finally bathed that cheek that had been dry for so long, through time and suffering. Old Elias, who for some time had been beside himself with consternation, took advantage of an instant in which the women raised the countess's head to help her drink, to hold before her a gold necklace, with a beautiful cross in the same metal, encrusted with costliest diamonds of dazzling splendor. In doing so, the old man added the following names, Virginia and Sylvia. Sylvia, exclaimed the countess, and her glassy eyes stared at the precious jewelry as if it were a talisman, and her fine head fell back upon the pillow, like a flower in the blazing desert wind that drops upon its stem, never to straighten again. But the final hour of that beautiful victim of betrayal had not yet struck. She stirred a moment later, as if touched by an electric current, opened her eyes, and turned to Marzia with such an ardent expression of love that only a mother can understand and cherish. My daughter, she exclaimed, and fell back again. At that very moment, a man with a bandaged face hurried precipitously into the room, kneeled between the 2 beds of the wounded women, and cried desperately, Forgive me. Forgive me. Countess Virginia was electrified by that cry. She sat up with extraordinary speed and glancing down upon the prostrate wretch, exclaimed in a heart-rending voice, Marzia. Marzia, that villain is your father. Etienne drew his wallet from his pocket, took from it a letter sealed with a large black seal, and gave it to Georges, adding, My dear son, read this letter. Read it aloud. And you, Lucy Fortier, listen. Georges Durier took the letter with trembling hand. He seemed not to have the courage to break the seal. Read, repeated the artist. The young man ripped open the envelope and read, My beloved Georges. In the month of September 1861, a poor woman, with a child in her arms, presented herself at my house at Chevry. That poor woman had been persecuted, spied upon, victim of the triple accusation of murder, theft, and arson. Her name was Jean Fortier. These words were followed by a triple exclamation made simultaneously by Georges, Lucy, and Lucien Lebrun. I, said Georges, confused. I am the son of Jean Fortier and Lucy. Lucy is my sister. At the same time he held his arms out to the young girl. My brother, exclaimed Lucy, throwing herself toward Georges, who held her in a tight embrace. Yes, yes, he then exclaimed. This is the proof of the crime. Oh, mother, God has finally then been moved to pity. But this final proof, which was thought to have been lost, where was it? In the side of the small papier-mâché horse you were carrying when you and your mother arrived at Chevry, replied Etienne Castel. Can you prove it? This is her death certificate. The real Paul Harmont, the millionaire, the great industrialist, former associate of James Mortimer, is none other than Jacques Giraud. Marius abruptly drew his chair closer to Thénardier's, who noted this movement and continued with the deliberation of an orator who holds his interlocutor and feels his adversary palpitating under his words. This man, forced to conceal himself for reasons, moreover, which are foreign to politics, had adopted the sewer as his domicile and had a key to it. It was, I repeat, the 6th of June, toward 8 in the evening. Do you understand now? The person who carried the corpse was Jean Valjean, the one who had the key is speaking to you at this moment, and the piece of the coat. Thénardier completed the phrase by drawing from his pocket at eye level, nipped between his 2 thumbs and his 2 forefingers, a strip of torn black cloth, covered with dark spots. Marius had sprung to his feet, pale, hardly able to draw his breath, with his eyes riveted on the fragment of black cloth, and without uttering a word, without taking his eyes from that fragment, he retreated and fumbled with his right hand along the wall for a key that was in the lock of a cupboard near the chimney. He found the key, opened the cupboard, and plunged his arm into it without looking, and without his frightened gaze quitting the rag, which Thénardier still held outspread. But the other continued, Monsieur le Baron, I have the strongest of reasons for believing that the assassinated young man was an opulent stranger lured into a trap by Jean Valjean, and the bearer of an enormous sum of money. The young man was myself, and here is the coat, cried Marius, and he flung upon the floor an old black coat all covered with blood. Then, snatching the fragment from the hands of Thénardier, he crouched down over the coat, and laid the torn piece against the tattered skirt. It fitted exactly, and the strip completed the coat. Good heavens! Exclaimed Villefort, stepping back fearfully. Surely that is not the voice of Abbé Busoni. No. The abbé threw off the false tonsure, shook his head, and his hair, no longer confined, fell in black masses around his manly face. It is the face of the Count of Monte Cristo, cried Villefort, with a haggard expression. You are not exactly right, Monsieur Procureur. You must go farther back. That voice, where did I first hear it? You heard it for the first time at Marseille, 23 years ago, the day of your marriage with Mademoiselle de Saint Méran. Refer to your papers. You are not Busoni? You are not Monte Cristo? Oh, heavens! You are then some secret, implacable, and mortal enemy. I must have wronged you in some way at Marseille. Oh, woe to me! Yes, you are right, said the Count, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Search. But what have I done to you? Exclaimed Villefort, whose mind was balancing between reason and insanity, in the cloud that is neither a dream nor reality. What have I done to you? Tell me, then. Speak. You condemned me to a horrible, slow death. You killed my father. You deprived me of liberty, of love, and happiness. Who are you, then? Who are you? Good Lord! I am the spectre of a wretch you buried in the dungeons of the Château d'If. When he at length issued from his tomb, heaven gave him the mask of the Count of Monte Cristo, enriched him with gold and diamonds, and led him to you. Ah, I recognize you, exclaimed the king's attorney. I am Edmond Dantès. The Count of Monte Cristo turned dreadfully pale, his eyes seemed to burn with a devouring fire. He bounded toward a dressing room near his bedroom and in a trice, tearing off his cravat, his coat, and waistcoat, he put on a sailor's jacket and hat beneath which rolled his long black hair. He returned thus, formidable and implacable, advancing with his arms crossed on his breast, toward the general who was waiting for him, and who, feeling his teeth chatter and his legs sink beneath him, drew back a step, and only stopped when he found a table to support his clenched hand. Fernand, cried he, of my 100 names I need only tell you one to overwhelm you. But you guess it now, do you not? The general, with his head thrown back, hands extended, gaze fixed, looked silently at this dreadful apparition. Then seeking the wall to support him, he glided along close to it until he reached the door, through which he went out backward, uttering this single mournful, lamentable, distressing cry, Edmond Dantès. Then, with sighs that were hardly human, he dragged himself as far as the porchway of the house, across the courtyard like a drunken man, and fell into the arms of his manservant. Do you repent? Asked a deep, solemn voice, which caused Danglars' hair to stand on end. His feeble eyes endeavored to distinguish objects, and behind the bandit he saw a man wrapped in a cloak, half hidden by the shadow of a stone column. Of what must I repent? Stammered Danglars. Of the evil you have done, said the voice. Oh, yes, I repent, exclaimed Danglars. And he struck his breast with his emaciated fist. Then I forgive you, said the man, dropping his cloak and advancing to the light. The Count of Monte Cristo, said Danglars, more pale from terror than he had been just before from hunger and misery. You are mistaken. I am not the Count of Monte Cristo. Then who are you? I am he whom you sold, betrayed, dishonored. I am he upon whom you trampled that you might raise yourself to fortune. I am he whose father you condemned to die of hunger. I am he whom you also condemned to starvation, and who yet forgives you, because he too hopes to be forgiven. I am Edmond Dantes. Then he burst into a frightening laugh and began to dance before the body. He had gone mad. 1. Oh, the delights of Anagnorisis and the false stranger. Nor have they been rejected by Achille Campanile, who employed them, though with surreal good sense, at the beginning of his novel Se la luna mi porta fortuna, 1928. Anyone, on that grey morning of the 16th of December 19, furtively entering, and at their own risk and peril, the bedroom where the opening scene of our story takes place, would have been exceedingly surprised to find a young man with curly hair and pale cheeks, pacing nervously backward and forward. A young man whom no one would have recognized as Dr. Falcuccio, first of all because he was not Dr. Falcuccio, and, in the second place, because he bore not the slightest resemblance to Dr. Falcuccio. We observe, in passing, that the surprise of anyone furtively entering that room to which we refer is wholly unjustified. That man was in his own home and had every right to pace about in whatever way he pleased. From Au Pair, Romanzi e Racconti, 1924-1933. Published in the Almanacco del Bibliofilo, Biblionostalgia, Divagazioni Sentimentali sulle letture degli anni più verdi, edited by Mario Scognamiglio, Milan. Rovello, 2008. Ulysses. That's all we needed. A strange novel, came out a few years ago, from the pen of Giacomo Joyce, or Joyce as Guido Piovine calls him, or Joyce. Few have read it, since it is written in English, a little used language. In attempting to describe it, now that the French translation is available for more educated readers, I feel such a confusion, victim of feelings as incoherent as the work that inspires them, that I shall proceed by way of observations here and there, notes for further development, which I propose to number so as not to give the impression that these paragraphs are intended to follow each other in any logical or consistent order. 1. This work, like Joyce's other books, was known in Italy only to a few, and most of them had heard about it from others, since there were rumors about it in artistic gatherings and intellectual salons. A few rare copies of this Ulysses, later translated as Ulisse, since that is the name of Homer's hero in the English language, were thus passed about from hand to hand, loaned reluctantly, desperately sought to be understood, leaving a confused and murky impression of scandal, of monstrous chaos. 2. There again, having already read his previous book, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, we realize that at the end of the book everything falls to pieces, and the writing as well as the ideas explode into damp fragments, like wet gunpowder. 3. Let us say straightaway, after a first, laborious reading and without further ado, that Ulysses is not a work of art. 4. In his approach to the novel, Joyce has brought a kind of psychological and stylistic pointillism that never adds up to anything, which is why not only Joyce but those like him, such as Proust and Svevo, are faddish phenomena destined not to last. 5. It is no surprise that Joyce, a second-rate Irish poet living in Trieste, says it was he who discovered Svevo, another author who writes atrociously. In any event, Svevo is perhaps the Italian writer who has come closer than anyone else to that passively analytical literature that reached its culmination in Proust, and it is second-rate art if art is the work of keen and active men, if a painter is worth more than a mirror. 6. Joyce is basically one of those called to perpetuate the bad taste of the worst kind of Italian bourgeoisie. But thank God and Mussolini, Italy is not all bourgeois, enthralled to Europe and Paris. 7. But so be it, seeing that someone on the banks of the Seine has decided to translate this work. And anyone who reaches the last page arrives shocked and nauseated, as if emerging from an interminable tunnel piled full of garbage and inhabited by monsters. Joyce is a shower of ash that suffocates everything. The Romantics made you aspire to being a fallen angel, and now this relentless confessor convinces you that you are an idle animal with erotic tendencies and with some vague ambition toward the most seedy and feral kind of magic. Your very dreams, of which you were rather proud, are none other than realistic nocturnal Sabbaths, a delirium of matter seeking to indulge in the orgy of your thoughts. Once again, there is no escape. In his works there is certainly an enormous patience, almost insane, almost intelligent, though uninspired, but Joyce's truth is a secondary, transitory truth, too closely bound up with our empirical existence. 8. It seems that Ungaretta, one of those so-called Hermetic poets, has seen a relationship between Joyce and Rabelais. There is certainly a parallel disunity in the well-defined structure of the two worlds, of Rabelais and Joyce. There is the systematic disorder from which gush forth, in one, the classic forces of the imagination, of poetic representation, of myth, and in the other, those forces of modern intelligence, taste, human representation, and psychology. There is, I repeat, the disunity that, in Rabelais, turns an epic subject into a grotesque, absurd, metaphysical film, a subject that is fluid and formless, loose, dissonant, yet concise. And he transforms a flamboyant crowd of characters, who could all be brave heroes of classical poetry, into abnormal, nightmarish, outlandish types. But Joyce, over a simple event, over an almost sentimental, simply psychological situation, which is a man waking up in the morning, produces detailed and infinitesimal effects, divisionistic impressions, dark illusions in reverse, in a fantastic array of calculations directed at the atom, at the cell, at the essentially chemical composition of thought. In short, The former enters a realm of superhuman absurdity, relying upon an architecture of absolute fantasy, the latter a continent of subhuman reverie that can only be penetrated with the scalpel, magnifying glass, and tweezers of dernier cri cleverness. 9. Joyce might perhaps be counted as a writer of the so-called literature of psychoanalysis, but he exhibits qualities that exclude him even from this genre of literature. He embraces man as he is, a rough formation of feelings, a profundity that can also be called shallowness and, as already suggested, a mixture of stupidity, prejudice, vague cultural recollections, shabby sentimentalism, and sexual arrogance. Psychoanalysis offers him, moreover, a method that he would have been better off using far less, without straying in any way from his purpose and from his descriptive results. In this respect his testimony is merely scientific, not literary. And it ought to be clear that in the history of literature he belongs to a well-worn, well-rehearsed tradition, according to which he must certainly resign himself to being a late and slight imitator, beside the honored places of Dostoevsky, Zola, and, to some degree, Samuel Butler. 10. Some regard Proust or Joyce as leading figures in the historical moment of which they are clearly the product. But we are bound to say that, for us, they do not represent the spirituality of today. Their vision of the world, that particular and general Weltanschauung expressed in them is, for us, worthless, precisely because it relates to the mentality of the society that has produced them. But when we call for a collectivist novel, we are asking to be given, at last, a novel in which human relationships, society, love, and our whole life are seen from that new viewpoint that constitutes for us the new morality and a new way of living. We have already indicated how this new ethic of ours becomes a part, a necessary corollary, of what is taking place, of the social and human phenomenon of the corporations we so fervently support. One is a new approach to our life, and we have already indicated that for this very reason we oppose all forms of decadent individualistic and bourgeois novels, autobiographies, self-referential diaries, psychologisms of self-awareness. 11. The truth is that writers from beyond the Alps, such as Giacomo Joyce, Davide Alberto Lawrence, Tommaso Mann, Giuliano Huxley, and Andrea Gide, have sacrificed their poetic truth and integrity to petty, elegant acrobatics. Each and every one of these so-called European artists have on their faces the devilish smile of someone who, from time to time, holding a paramount truth, starts playing about with it. The truth they hold, and with which they play such dangerous games, is poetic truth, their genuine feelings. They all manhandle this supreme gift by mutual agreement. It seems they intend to erect a tower of intellectual falsehood, each in their own way, but each taking the same liberty. And that is why Joyce's work lacks measure, like a goat forced to give birth to a dog. 12. Joyce has obviously been taken by the devil of illusion and free association, and the idea of composing a page of prose like a page of actual music is a stupidity introduced into literature by the Wagnerian fashion that raged at the end of the 19th century. Joyce interweaves leitmotifs rendered unrecognizable by a dense counterpoint of illusions. But what is more, he seeks to match his episodes with color tones. The prevailing color will be red here, green there, and so forth. It is the confusion of the arts that began timidly with Baudelaire and became a commonplace of the decadent movement, after Rimbaud's famous sonnet on the colors of vowels. Colored hearing, verbal orchestrations. That path, as we know, brought us to pictures made from bits of newspaper and bottle ends. The language of Joyce is a deliquescent language, and, allow me here to use a Joycean pun, a delinquent language. Joyce has allowed himself to be tempted by the demon of Esperanto. 13. The problem is that we must get beyond the communistic novels of Tommaso Mann. Joyce has simply transformed the interior monologue modestly invented by Dujardin into verbal diarrhea, thus tainting the fine, succinct, dynamic, simultaneous parole in liberta boldly invented by our futurists, those true artists of the regime. 14. The spirit of nationhood must not be abandoned. Joyce, eager for success, very soon adapted to the new artistic internationalism, abandoning the reality of true feeling and formulating in his new works the most wrongful act of rebellion against the national spirit from which he had sprung, mocking the nationhood, language, and religion of his country. From a portrait of the artist onward, vilifying his humanity, he reverted to chaos, to confused dreaming, to the subconscious. He died strangled by his own baleful demon, and all that remained were the sterile pedantic audacities of a sort of psychoanalysis that grafts itself onto Freud's method with the violence of his arbiters. A fragmentary spirit, more interested in the transient than the durable, the Irishman's attitude is feminine, not for the open gentleness that must always pervade the Hellenic spirit of an artist, but for the indifferent pose of the pseudo-intellectual with one foot in physiological corruption and the other in the madhouse. One cannot but declare all of this to be an example of work in decline, worthy at most of a pornographic trader in junk novels. Joyce is a typical exponent of modern decadence, a festering and infectious cell even in our own literature. Why? Because, with his anti-classicism, he stands in opposition to the figures of ancient and modern Latin civilization, against whom he has taken a satirical attitude. He confers an impure and subversive character to his revolt by removing universal Rome from the altar and replacing it with the gilded idol of Jewish internationalism, an internationalism that for many years has supported too many currents of modern thought. The fact is that Joyce has played court to that organization of Jews, proponent of men and ideas, which has especially held the field in Paris. Joyce is against all that is Latin, whether it be imperial civilization or Catholic civilization. He is anti-Latin for an ulterior motive. His jibes against Rome and the papacy, made in a clownish and shameful manner, would be less irksome if it were not apparent that concealed in them was a form of enticement toward the children of Israel. 15. But does the contemporary novel really have to descend from the pond to the sewer, and here in Italy of all places, crucible of moral renewal and spiritual restoration? Must Joyce be taken as a model, an author in whom morality, religion, sense of family and society, virtue, duty, beauty, courage, heroism, sacrifice, in other words, Western civilization as well as genuine humanity, are all lost and the Jewish worm destroys everything? 16. This is the truth, and little weight should be given to defenses of Joyce from the pens, sold to whom? Of Corrado Pavellini, Annibale Pastor, or Adelchi Bertone, not to mention Montal, Benco, Lanati, Cecchi, or Panunzio. And it is easy for Panunzio to say that the real problem for Italian literature is to become European once and for all, to graft itself onto the powerful trunk of foreign literature and to be truly original in doing so, to have something of its own to say, through observation, love, suffering, in our own reality that we find around us, which is not the usual repetition of the far from pitiful tales of Aunt Teresa or Uncle Michel and, worse still, the pseudo-poetical description of fantastic journeys, pointless returns, tram rides in suburbia. How much travel there is in this literature? 17. The real attack on the spirit of New Italy is in narrative prose itself, where a whole miserable net has been woven, from Italo Svevo, a Jew thrice over, to Alberto Moravia, a Jew 6 times over, to fish out from the murky depths of society repugnant figures of men who are not men, but inert beings, besmirched with base and repugnant sensuality, physically and morally sick. And the masters of all these narrators are those pathological lunatics named Marcelo Proust and Giacomo Joyce, foreign names and Jews right to the bone, and defeatists to the roots of their hairpoint too. Appeared in Almanacco del Bibliofilo, Recensioni in ritardo. Ontologia di singolari e argued presentazioni di opere letterarie antiche e moderna, famose, poco note, e sconosciuta, edited by Mario Scognamiglio, Milan. Rovello, 2009. Why the island is never found. Utopias are found on islands, with a few rare exceptions, such as the realm of Prester John. The island is thought of as inaccessible, a non-place where you land by chance, and once you have left, you can never return. So only on an island can a perfect civilization be created, and we discover it only through legends. The Greek civilization lived on archipelagos and ought to have been quite used to islands, yet it is only on mysterious islands that Ulysses meets Circe, Polyphemus, and Nausicaa. There are those islands we read about in Apollonius of Rhodes's Argonautica. There are the blessed or fortunate islands where St. Brendan lands during his voyage. Thomas More's City of Utopia is on an island, and there are those perfect, thriving unknown civilizations dreamed about in the 17th and 18th centuries, such as Foyni's Terra Australis and Virasi's island of Sevrumbes. The mutineers from the Bounty search for the lost paradise on an island. Without finding it, Verne's Captain Nemo lives on an island. Both Stevenson's and the Count of Monte Cristo's treasures lie hidden on an island, and so on until we reach the dystopias, from the island of Dr. Moreau's Beast Folk to the island of Dr. No, where James Bond lands. What is the fascination of islands? It is not so much that they are places cut off from the rest of the world. Marco Polo or Giovanni Pian del Carpine found places far away from human society by crossing endless tracts of terra firma. Until the 18th century, when it became possible to calculate longitude, mariners would come across an island merely by chance, and, like Ulysses, would escape from it, but there was no way of finding their way back there. From the time of St. Brendan, and even up to Gazzano, an island was always an insula perdita, a lost island. This explains the success and fascination of that highly popular genre of island stories in the 15th and 16th centuries, which provide a record of all the islands in the world, known islands as well as those about which there were just a few vague legends. The island stories, in their own way, provided as much geographical accuracy as possible, unlike the tales of fabulous lands in earlier centuries, and were a blend of folk tales and travelers' accounts. Sometimes they were wrong. It was thought, for example, that there were 2 islands, Taprobane and Ceylon, whereas in fact, as we know, there was just one, but so what? They represented a geography of the unknown or, at least, the little known. Later came the journals of the 18th century travelers, Cook, Bougainville, Le Perouse. They too were looking for islands but were careful to describe only what they saw, no longer relying on folk traditions, and that was quite a different matter. But still they went off looking for islands that didn't exist, such as Terra Australis, which appeared on all atlases, or for an island that someone had once discovered but had never been found again. This is why, still today, our fantasies drift between the myth of an island that doesn't exist, or the myth of absence, that of one island too many, or the myth of excess, that of the undiscovered island, or the myth of inaccuracy, or that of the unrediscovered island, or the myth of the Insula Perdita, the lost island, 4 quite different stories. The first is a legendary story. Legends about islands are generally divided into those that require us to pretend the island exists, asking us to suspend our belief, as with the islands of Verne or Stevenson, and those that describe an island that does not exist by definition and have the sole purpose of reaffirming the power of legends, as with Peter Pan's Neverland. The island that, by definition, does not exist is of no interest to us, at least today. The reason is simple. No one goes looking for it. Children don't go to sea looking for Captain Hook's island, nor do adults go in search of Captain Nemo's island. Likewise, I will pass over the one island too many, not least because there is, I believe, only one case of this phenomenon of excess, the duplication of Ceylon and Taprobane. This story has been told in much detail in an article on Island Stories by Tarcisio Lancioni 1, to which I refer you. In fact, what interests me today is that unfortunate love for an island that can no longer be found, whereas Taprobane was always being found, even when no one was looking for it, and therefore, in terms of sexual exploits, we might say it was not so much a story of hopeless passion as one of Don Giovanni-like incontinence, where the number of maps showing Taprobane had already reached mille. According to Pliny, Taprobane was discovered during the time of Alexander the Great, and prior to that had been generally indicated as the land of the Antikythones and considered another world. Pliny's island could be identified as Ceylon, and this can be seen from Ptolemy maps, at least in the 16th century editions. Isidore of Seville also places it to the south of India and confines himself to saying that it is full of precious stones and has 2 summers and 2 winters each year. Marco Polo's travels doesn't give the name Taprobane but refers to Ceylon as Cylum. The duplication of Ceylon and Taprobane appears quite clearly in Mandeville's travels, which describes them in 2 different chapters. He doesn't say exactly where Ceylon is located but states that it is, well, 800 miles about, and is full of serpents, of dragons and of cocodrills, that no man dare dwell there. These cocodrills be serpents, yellow and rayed above, and have 4 feet and short thighs, and great nails as claws or talons. And there be some that have 5 fathoms in length, and some of 6 and of 8 and of 10. And when they go by places that be gravelly, it seemeth as though men had drawn a great tree through the gravelly place. And there be also many wild beasts, and namely of elephants. In that isle is a great mountain. And in mid-place of the mount is a great lake in a full fair plain, and there is great plenty of water. And they of the country say, that Adam and Eve wept upon that mountain 100 year, when they were driven out of paradise, and that water, they say, is of their tears. For so much water they wept, that made the foresaid lake. And in the bottom of that lake men find many precious stones and great pearls. In that lake grow many reeds and great canes, and there within be many cocodrills and serpents and great water leeches. And the king of that country, once every year, giveth leave to poor men to go into the lake to gather them precious stones and pearls, by way of alms, for the love of God that made Adam. And all the year men find enough. And for the vermin that is within, they anoint their arms and their thighs and legs with an ointment made of a thing that is clept lemons, that is a manner of fruit like small peas. And then have they no dread of no cocodrills, nay of none other venomous vermin. In that country and others thereabout there be wild geese that have 2 heads. The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, chapter 21. Taprobane, on the other hand, according to Mandeville, is under the rule of Prester John. Mandeville had not yet sighted Prester John's realm in Ethiopia, as he would later do, and it was still in the area of India, though Prester John's India was often confused with the farthest Orient, the land of earthly paradise. In any event, Taprobane is to be found in the vicinity of India, and he names the point where the Red Sea flows into the ocean. Like Isidore's account, the island has 2 summers and 2 winters, and there are enormous mountains of gold guarded by pismires, or giant ants. These pismires be great as hounds, so that no man dare come to those hills, for the pismires would assail them and devour them anon. So that no man may get of that gold, but by great sleight. And therefore when it is great heat, the pismires rest them in the earth, from prime of the day into noon. And then the folk of the country take camels, dromedaries, and horses and other beasts, and go thither, and charge them in all haste that they may. And after that, they flee away in all haste that the beasts may go, or the pismires come out of the earth. And in other times, when it is not so hot, and that the pismires rest them not in the earth, then they get gold by this subtlety. They take mares that have young colts or foals, and lay upon the mares void vessels made therefore, and they be all open above, and hanging low to the earth. And then they send forth those mares for to pasture about those hills, and withhold the foals with them at home. And when the pismires see those vessels, they leap in anon. And they have this kind that they let nothing be empty among them, but anon they fill it, be it what manner of thing that it be, and so they fill those vessels with gold. And when that the folk suppose that the vessels be full, they put forth anon the young foals, and make them to neigh after their dams. And then anon the mares return towards their foals with their charges of gold. The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, chapter 33. From this point onward, from one map to the next, Taprobane moves about from one place in the Indian Ocean to another, sometimes alone, sometimes duplicating Ceylon. For a certain period it is identified with Sumatra, but sometimes we find it between Sumatra and Indochina, close to Borneo. Thomas Porcacci, in I Sol Più Famoso del Mondo, 1572, tells us about a Taprobane full of riches, about its elephants and its immense turtles, as well as the characteristic attributed by Diodorus Siculus to its inhabitants, a kind of forked tongue, double as far as the root and divided. With one part they talk to one person, with the other they talk to another. After having recounted various folk stories, he then apologizes to readers for the fact that he has found no exact reference as to its geographical position, and concludes, although many ancient and modern writers have referred to this island, I find no one however who indicates its boundaries. Hence I too will have to be excused if in this my usual order is lacking. As for the island of Taprobane's identification with Ceylon, he is doubtful. She was first, according to Ptolemy, called Simondi, and then Salis, and finally Taprobane. But people nowadays conclude that today she is called Sumatra, though there are also those according to whom Taprobane is not Sumatra but the island of Xylem. But some people now suggest that none of the ancients have positioned Taprobane correctly. Indeed, they hold that where they have put it there is no island at all that can be believed to be that. From being one island too many, Taprobane therefore slowly became an island that doesn't exist. Thomas More would treat it thus when he situated his Utopia between Ceylon and America, and Tommaso Campanella was to use Taprobane as the place where he built his city of the sun. Let us now turn to islands whose absence has encouraged, sometimes sporadic, research and an enduring nostalgia. Ancient epics, of course, tell us about islands that may or may not have existed, so that the isles visited by Ulysses have produced a scholarly literature aimed at establishing which actual places they refer to. And the myth of Atlantis has led to an investigation that is not yet over, judging from the number of mystery magazines and second-rate television programs. But Atlantis was regarded rather more as an entire continent, and the idea was immediately accepted that it had sunk into the sea. It is therefore the subject of legend rather than research. Navigatio Sancti Brendani was perhaps the first account of the quest for an island. Saint Brendan and his mystical mariners visited many: the island of birds, the island of hell, the island reduced to a rock on which Judas is chained, and that bogus island that had already deceived Sinbad, on which Brendan's ship lands. Not until the following day, when the ship's crew light fires and see the island stir in annoyance, do they realize it is not an island but a terrible sea monster called Josconius. But the island that excited the imagination of those in later times is the Isle of the Blessed, a sort of earthly paradise on which our mariners land after 7 years of adventure. A land more precious than all the others for its beauty, for the marvelous and gracious and agreeable things within it, such as its beautiful and clear and precious rivers with waters most sweet and fresh and gentle, and trees most precious in every way with precious fruits, and many roses and lilies and flowers and violas and herbs and all things sweet-smelling and perfect in their bounty. And there were songbirds of every agreeable nature, and all sang harmoniously in sweet and gentle song, and the climate seemed truly agreeable like sweet springtime. And there were roads and paths of every kind, precious stones, and there was so much good that greatly cheered the heart of all those who saw it with their own eyes, and there were tame and wild animals of every kind, and they moved about and lived at their own ease and as they pleased, and lived together in domesticity without wishing to cause any harm or disturbance to the other, and there were birds of the same kind who lived together similarly. And there were vineyards and pergolas always well supplied with fine grapes that its goodness and beauty exceeded all others. The island paradise visited by Saint Brendan awakens a desire, something that hadn't happened with Atlantis, Ogygia, or the island of the Phaeacians. Throughout the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance there is a firm belief that it exists. It appears on maps, such as the Ebersdorf globe. On a map prepared by Toscanelli for the King of Portugal, it appears in the middle of the sea, toward Japan, to be reached buscando el levante por el poniente, approaching the east via the west, and lies almost prophetically where America would later be discovered. It is sometimes on the same latitude as Ireland, though on more modern maps the island moves farther south to the latitude of the Canaries or the Fortunate Isles, and sometimes the Fortunate Isles are confused with the island called Saint Brendan. Sometimes it is identified with Madeira and sometimes with another non-existent island such as the mythical Antillia, as it was called in the 16th century Arte del Navegar by Pedro da Medina. In Martin Behaim's globe of 1492 it was positioned much farther west, close to the equator. And it now had the name Lost Island, Insula Perdita. Honorius of Autun, in his De Imagine Mundi, 12th century, had described it as the most pleasant of islands, unknown to humans, which even when it had been found, had not been found, est caedum oceani insula dicta perdita. Amo initate et fertilitate omnium rerum praecunctis terras praestantissima, hominibus ignata. Quae aliquando casu inventa, postea quasida non est inventa, et ideo dicitur perdita. And in the 14th century, Pierre Bersuire spoke in the same terms about the Fortunate Isles. It is apparent from the Treaty of Évora of June 1519 that the lost island was expected to be rediscovered one day. Under the treaty, King Manuel I of Portugal passed all rights over the Canary Isles to Spain, and the terms of the treaty expressly included a lost or hidden isle. In 1569, Gerardus Mercator still marked the mysterious island on his map, and in 1721 the last explorers set off in search of it. 2. St. Brendan's Island is not an island that doesn't exist. Someone has actually been there, but it is lost since no one has succeeded in returning to it. For this reason it becomes the subject of an unfulfilled desire, and its story is an allegory of every real love story, the story of a brief encounter, of a mystical Dr. Zhivago who has lost his Lara. The agony of love is not the love we dream of that never happens, the island that we know doesn't exist, the illusion of love for adolescent lovers, but the love that, having once happened, then vanishes forever. But how did islands come to be lost? From earliest antiquity, ships had no points of reference other than the stars. Using instruments like the astrolabe or the cross staff, sailors could fix the height of a star from the horizon and calculate the distance from the zenith point. Once they knew the declination, they knew on what parallel they were, given that the zenith distance plus or minus declination gives latitude. They therefore knew how far north or south they were from a given point. But to get back to an island, or any other point, The latitude was not enough, the longitude was also needed. We know that New York and Naples are on the same latitude, but we also know they're not in the same place. Their longitude is different and they are therefore on a different degree of the meridian. And this is the problem that navigators faced until almost the end of the 18th century. There were no certain means for determining longitude, for saying how far east or west they were from a given point. This is what happened with the Solomon Islands, an extraordinary example of insulae perditae. Alvaro de Saavedra Serran went in search of these legendary islands in 1528, hoping to find King Solomon's gold, but was sailing about between what are now called the Marshall and the Admiralty Islands. Alvaro de Mendaña arrived there, however, in 1568 and christened the Solomon Islands. But, after that, no one managed to find them again, not even Mendaña himself when he went back with Quiros, almost 30 years later, in search of them, though he only just missed them, landing instead on the island of Santa Cruz, to the southeast. And the same happened to others after him. The Dutch set up their East Indies Company at the beginning of the 17th century and created the city of Batavia in Asia as a point of departure for many eastbound expeditions. They landed at a place they called New Holland, but never reached the Solomon Islands. Other lands, probably to the east of the Solomon Islands, were similarly discovered by English pirates whom the court of St. James hastened to reward with noble titles. But no one was able to find any trace of the Solomon Islands, and for a long time many believed them to be only a legend. Mendaña had landed on them but had incorrectly fixed their longitude. And even if, through some celestial guidance, he had managed to fix them correctly, then other navigators looking for that longitude, and he himself on his second voyage, could not be entirely sure of their own longitude. For several centuries the great European maritime powers strove to discover a way of establishing the fixed point, the punto fijo that Cervantes had joked about, and were prepared to pay enormous sums to anyone who found an effective method. Navigators, men of science, and cranks came up with all kind of answers. There was the method based on lunar eclipses, one that examined the variations of a magnetized needle, and the LOC, or Dutchman's log method. Galileo proposed a technique based on the eclipses of the satellites of Jupiter, which are so frequent that they can be seen several times each night. But all turned out to be inadequate. There would, of course, have been one sure method: to keep a clock on board that tells the time at one known meridian, then to find out the time at place X at sea and, by working on the basis that the globe has been subdivided since antiquity into 360 degrees of longitude and that the sun moves 15 degrees in 1 hour, to work out the longitude of point X from the difference. In other words, if the clock on board showed that it was, let us say, noon in Paris, and that in place X it was 6 in the afternoon, by translating every hour of difference into 15 degrees, we would have known that the longitude of place X was 90 degrees from the Paris meridian. Although it was not difficult to work out the time at the place where the calculation was being made, it was practically impossible to keep a mechanical clock on board that would function perfectly after months of sailing in the inevitable jolts, through winds and waves. Hourglasses and water clocks were, of course, out of the question since they need to work on a flat, motionless surface. And any clock would have to be of an extremely high precision. An error of 4 seconds would produce an error of 1 degree of longitude. One suggestion mentioned in various chronicles of the time was the use of powder of sympathy. This was a miraculous compound that, when applied to the weapon that had caused a wound, acted, through a sort of almost atomic continuity, on the particles of blood released into the air over the wound, even if the weapon and the injury were a great distance apart. This would heal the wound, allowing time to take its course, but as an immediate reaction it would cause irritation and pain. It was therefore decided to wound a dog, to be kept on board the ship during the journey, and to rub the miraculous compound over the weapon each day at the same hour. The dog would have reacted with a whimper of pain, and that was how they would know aboard ship what time it was at that moment at the point of departure. Point 3. I dealt with this story in my novel The Island of the Day before, so allow me to quote one passage since, after all, on such uncertain information, this is the only document that suggests what must have occurred. Finally one morning, taking advantage of a sailor's bad fall from a yardarm, which fractured his skull, while there was great confusion on the deck and the doctor was summoned to treat the unfortunate man, Roberto slipped down into the hold. Almost groping, he managed to find the right path. Perhaps it was luck, or perhaps the animal was whimpering more than usual that morning. Roberto, more or less at the point where later on the Daphne he would find the kegs of aquavitae, was confronted by a horrid sight. Well shielded from curious eyes, in an enclosure made to his measure, on a bed of rags, lay a dog. He was perhaps of good breed, but his suffering and hunger had reduced him to mere skin and bones. And yet his tormentors showed their intention to keep him alive. They had provided him with abundant food and water, including food surely not canine, subtracted from the passengers' rations. He was lying on one side, head limp, tongue lolling. On that exposed side gaped a broad and horrible wound. At once fresh and gangrenous, it revealed a pair of great pinkish lips, and in the center, as along the entire gash, was a purulent secretion resembling whey. Roberto realized that the wound looked as it did because the hand of a chirurgeon, rather than sew the lips together, had deliberately kept them parted and open, attaching them to the outer hide. Bastard offspring of the medical art, that wound had not only been inflicted but wickedly treated so it would not form a scar and the dog would continue suffering, who knows for how long. Further, Roberto saw in and around the wound a crystalline residue, as if a doctor, yes, a doctor, so cruelly expert, every day sprinkled an iridine salt there. Helpless, Roberto stroked the wretch, now whimpering softly. He asked himself what he could do to help, but at a heavier touch, the dog's suffering increased. Moreover, Roberto's own pity was giving way to a sense of victory. There was no doubt. This was Dr. Bird's secret, the mysterious cargo taken aboard in London. From what Roberto had seen, from what a man with his knowledge could infer, the dog had been wounded in England, and Bird was making sure he would remain wounded. Someone in London, every day at the same agreed hour, did something to the guilty weapon, or to a cloth steeped in the animal's blood, provoking a reaction, perhaps of relief, but perhaps of still greater pain, for Dr. Bird himself had said that the weapon salve could also harm. Thus on the Amaryllis they could know at a given moment what time it was in Europe. And knowing the hour of their transitory position, they were able to calculate the meridian, translated by William Weaver. If the story about the dog seems fanciful, in the same novel I described an instrument proposed by Galileo in a letter of 1637, to Lorenzo Relio. Galileo thought of fixing longitude by observing the positions of Jupiter's satellites. But once again, on a ship at the mercy of the waves, it would be difficult to point the telescope accurately. And here Galileo suggested an extraordinary solution. To enjoy its comedy, we need not read the humorous account in my novel, it is enough to read Galileo himself. As for the first problem, this is certainly the most difficult, but I think I have found a remedy for this, at least for the ordinary movements of the ship. And this should be enough since, during great storms and tempests, which normally prevent the sun and other stars being seen, all other observations cease, as indeed do all mariners' duties. But during ordinary movements I think it is possible to reduce the state of the person who has to make the observations to a tranquility similar to that of the peace and calm of the sea. And to achieve this benefit I have thought of placing the observer in a specially prepared part of the boat so that he does not feel either the movements from bow to stern or the rocking from side to side. And my thinking is based on this. If the ship is always in calm waters and without waves, there is no doubt that the use of the telescope would be just as easy as on land. Now, I want to place the observer in a small boat placed inside the large boat, the small boat being in such necessary quantity of water as I will explain below. Here, first of all, it is clear that the water contained in the small vessel will remain in equilibrium, even when the large boat inclines and reclines to right and left, forward and backward, without any part of it being raised or lowered, but will always remain parallel to the horizon. So that if in this small boat we build another smaller boat, floating in the water contained within it, it would find itself in an extremely calm sea, and would therefore stay there without moving. And this second boat is the place where the observer must be placed. I therefore want the first vessel, which has to contain the water, to be like a large semi-spherical basin, and that the smaller vessel is similar to it, except that it is smaller, and that the space between its convex surface and the concave inner surface of the container is no more than the thickness of a thumb, so that a very small quantity of water will be enough to float the inner vessel, as if it were floating in the wide ocean. The size of these vessels must be such that the inner and smaller vessel can hold the weight of the person making the observations without sinking, as well as his chair and the other equipment on which the telescope is fixed. And in order to keep the smaller vessel separate from the outer one so as not to touch it, so that it cannot be influenced by the motion of the ship in the same way that the larger one is, I want the internal concave surface of the inner vessel to be held with several springs, 8 or 10 in number, which stop the two vessels from touching each other, but do not prevent the inner vessel from not responding to the raising and lowering of the sides of the outer container. And if, rather than water, we wish to use oil, that would be even better, nor would the quantity be. And in order to keep the smaller vessel separate from the outer one so as not to touch it, so that it cannot be influenced by the motion of the ship in the same way that the larger one is, I want the internal concave surface of the inner vessel to be held with several springs, 8 or 10 in number, which stop the two vessels from touching each other, but do not prevent the inner vessel from not responding to the raising and lowering of the sides of the outer container. And if, rather than water, we wish to use oil, that would be even better, nor would the quantity be great, since 2 or 3 barrels would be enough. Order to keep the smaller vessel separate from the outer one so as not to touch it, so that it cannot be influenced by the motion of the ship in the same way that the larger one is, I want the internal concave surface of the inner vessel to be held with several springs, 8 or 10 in number, which stop the two vessels from touching each other, but do not prevent the inner vessel from not responding to the raising and lowering of the sides of the outer container. And if, rather than water, we wish to use oil, that would be even better, nor would the quantity be great, since 2 or 3 barrels would be enough. I have already made a kind of curved helmet on the same principle, for the use of our galleys, which, when placed on the head of the observer, and a telescope being placed upon it, adjusted in such a way that it was always directed towards the same point at which the other free eye was looking, without doing anything else, the object that he was looking at with his free eye was always to be found through the telescope. A similar machine could be built which is not just held on the head but over the shoulders and bust of the observer, on which is fixed a telescope of the size necessary to clearly distinguish the stars of Jupiter. In order to resolve the problem, with all due respect to Galileo, whose extraordinary invention no one had the courage to finance, and to the whole plethora of inventors of other extraordinary methods for fixing longitude, we had to wait for Harrison's invention of the marine chronometer, or rather, his final version in the 1770s. From then on, even during storms, the clock would keep the correct time for the point of departure. But before that moment the insulae were faili perdite. Before then, the history of Pacific exploration is the history of people forever discovering lands they were not looking for. Abel Tasman, for example, while searching for the Solomon Islands in 1643, arrives at Tasmania, which is 42 degrees latitude farther south. As if that were nothing, sees New Zealand, passes Tonga, arrives in Fiji without disembarking, where he sees only a few small islands, and reaches the coast of New Guinea, without realizing that inside that loop he had made stood Australia. No mean achievement. He had gone from point to point like a billiard ball, and for many years after, other navigators came extremely close to Australia without seeing it. In short, it was a madcap voyage between islands, coral reefs, and continents, without any apparent plan. And poor them. We can set a course today using the maps created after Cook, but they were all basically wandering about like Captain Bligh, in a ship's launch, heading toward the Moluccas, and the most important thing was not to bump into the Bounty again. But even after the problem of longitude had been solved, it was still easy for ships to lose themselves among such islands. Look at the voyages of Cordo Maltese and Rasputin in Ballad of the Salt Sea. The characters in the ballad are avid readers. At one point, Pandora seems to be happily immersed in the complete works of Melville while Kane is reading Coleridge, the author of another ballad, the one about the ancient mariner. Curiously, he finds it on the German submarine of Slutter, who, when he dies, will also leave his copies of Rilke and Shelley at Escondida. And toward the end, Kane quotes Euripides. And even an old jailbird like Rasputin, at the very beginning, is reading Voyage autour du monde par la frégate du Roi Labodas et la Flûte l'Étoile. I can guarantee that this is not the first edition of 1771, which does not carry the author's name on the title page and is not in 3 columns. The book is open about halfway through and, at least in the original edition, of the same size, this is the point where Chapter 5 begins. Navigation depuis les Grandes Cyclades, découverte du Golfe de la Louisiade. Relâche, La Nouvelle-Bretagne. If he was up to date with the techniques of 1913, Rasputin ought to know that he is on the 155-degree meridian west, according to Hugo Pratt's map, but if he relies on Bougainville he should be on the crucial 180-degree meridian, the dateline. There again, Bougainville referred to the Isles Solomon dont l'existence et la position sont douteuses. When the Dutch cargo ship meets Rasputin's catamaran, the first thing the officers and the Fijian sailor notice is that the boat seems rather off course for a Fijian vessel, since the Fijians usually head east and south. And this is what they should have done, as we shall see later, since the Monk's Island is much farther southeast. Tell me why Cordo should find Slutter's submarine below the western point of New Pomerania. He is sailing west, having departed from Kasserine, whereas the submarine's destination is Escondida, and the Monk's Island of Escondida, 19 degrees south and 169 west, ought to be south of the Solomon Islands and west of Fiji. A German naval officer who sails toward New Guinea to get to Escondida and says, as he does, we'll be arriving shortly at Escondida, which is 20 degrees away, is caught in Rasputin's net, a dreamer who has confused the frontiers of space. The fact is that Rasputin or Pratt, or both, are also trying to confound the frontiers of time. Kane and Pandora are captured by Rasputin on November 1, 1913, but they all arrive at Escondida after August 4, 1914. The monk tells them that war has broken out on that date, at some time between September and the last 10 days of October, when the English appear on the scene. After 2 pages of Coleridge and a few discussions with Slutter, a year has passed, during which time the submarine navigates vague routes, with the curious indolence, the thirst for drifting, of 17th-century buccaneers, the ancient mariner, and Captain Ahab. All of the main characters in the ballad act as though they are living in the times of Bougainville, or even Mendonia. They travel in the archipelago of uncertainty. The fascination of islands is precisely that of losing ourselves. Heaven help us if we find our way straight back, like taking one of those wretched ferry crossings from Manhattan to Ellis Island. The eternal fascination of the island is still that celebrated by Guido Gazzano. But more beautiful than all, the island never found. The one the King of Spain had from his cousin. The King of Portugal with sealed signature. And papal bull in Gothic Latin. The Infante sailed off for the legendary realm. Saw the Fortunate Isles. Ionia, Gorgo, Hera. And the Sargasso Sea and the Dark Sea. Searching for that isle. But the island was not there. In vain the round-bottomed sailing galleys. In vain the caravels armed their bows. With due respect to the Pope, the isle is hidden. And Portugal and Spain still search for it. The isle exists, appearing sometimes from afar. Between Tenerife and Palma, suffused in mystery. The island never found. From the high peak of Tide the Good Canarian points it out to the foreigner. Marked on the ancient maps of the Corsairs. Haifola to be found? Haifola Pilgrim? The magic isle that glides over the seas. Mariners sometimes see her near, and point their bows toward her blessed shore. Among unfamiliar flowers soar lofty palms. The divine aromatic forest, thick and lush. Weeping cardamom, seeping rubber sap, herald like the arrival of a perfumed courtesan. The island never found, yet, if the pilot draws closer, it rapidly fades away, like a vain shadow, tinged with the azure color of faraway. La più bella. I don't suppose Gazzano had in mind some of the maps we find in 18th-century books on sea travel, but this idea of the island that fades away, like a vain shadow, tinged with the azure color of faraway, makes us think about the way in which, before the problem of longitude had been solved, islands were identified using drawings of their profiles as they had been seen for the first time. Arriving from a distance, the island, whose shape did not exist on any map, was recognized from its skyline, as we would say of an American city today. And what happened if there were two islands with very similar skylines, as if there were two cities, both with the Empire State Building and, at one time, the Twin Towers south of it? They would land on the wrong island, and who knows how many times this happened. Moreover, the profile of an island changes with the color of the sky, the haze, the time of day, and perhaps even the time of year, which alters the appearance of the vegetation. Sometimes the island is tinged with the azure color of faraway, it can disappear in the night or in the mist, or clouds can hide the shapes of its mountains. There is nothing more elusive than an island about which we know only its profile. Arriving on an island for which we have neither map nor coordinates is similar to moving about like one of Edwin Abbott's characters in Flatland, where there is only one dimension and we see things only from the front, like lines with no thickness, with no height and no depth, and only someone from outside Flatland could see them from above. And it was said, in fact, that the inhabitants of the islands of Madeira, La Palma, La Gomera, and El Hierro, deceived by the clouds or by the mirages of the Fata Morgana, sometimes thought they had seen the Insula Perdita toward the west, shimmering between the water and the sky. Thus, in the same way that an island that didn't exist could be sighted among the reflections of the sea, so it was also possible to confuse two islands that did exist, or never to find the one that was the intended destination. And that is how islands become lost, and why islands are never found. As Pliny said, Book 2, Chapter 96, some islands are forever wavering. Published in the Almanacco del Bibliofilo, Sul Orme di San Brandano, Milan. Rovello, 2011. And based on a paper given at a conference on islands held in Carloforte, Sardinia, in 2010. Thoughts on WikiLeaks. In terms of content, WikiLeaks has turned out to be a false scandal, but in terms of its formal implications, it has been, and will prove to be, something more. As we shall explain, it marks the beginning of a new chapter in history. A false scandal is one in which something becomes public that everyone had known, and had been talking about in private, and that, so to speak, was only being whispered about out of hypocrisy. For example, gossip about adultery. Everyone knows perfectly well, not just those well informed about diplomatic matters but anyone who has ever seen a film about international intrigues, that embassies have lost their diplomatic role since at least the end of the Second World War. In other words, since the time when heads of state could pick up the telephone or fly off to meet each other for dinner, was an ambassador sent off in a felucca to declare war on Saddam Hussein? Except for minor tasks of representation, they have been transformed, more overtly, into centers to gather information on the host country, with more competent ambassadors playing the role of sociologist or political commentator, and, more covertly, into full-blown dens of espionage. But now that this has been openly declared, American diplomacy has had to admit that it is true, and therefore to suffer a loss of image in formal terms, with the curious consequence that this loss, leak, flow of confidential information, rather than harming the supposed victims, Berlusconi, Sarkozy, Gaddafi, or Merkel, has harmed the supposed perpetrator, in other words, poor Mrs. Clinton, who was probably just receiving messages sent by embassy staff carrying out their official duties, as this was all they were being paid to do. This, from all the evidence, is exactly what Assange wanted, since his grudge is against the American government and not against Berlusconi's government. Why have the victims not been affected, except perhaps superficially? Because, as everyone realizes, the famous secret messages were simply press echo, and did no more than report what everyone in Europe already knew and was talking about, which had even appeared in America in Newsweek. The secret reports were therefore like the clippings files sent by company press offices to their managing director, who was too busy to read the newspapers. It is clear that the reports sent to Mrs. Clinton are not about secret dealings, they were not spy messages. And although they dealt with apparently highly confidential information, such as the fact that Berlusconi has private interests in Russian gas deals, even here, whether true or false, the messages would have done no more than repeat what had already been talked about by those who in fascist times were branded café strategists, in other words, those who talked politics at the bar. And this goes to confirm another well-known fact, that every dossier compiled for the Secret Service, in whatever country, consists entirely of material already in the public domain. The extraordinary American revelations about Berlusconi's wild nights reported what could have been read months earlier in any Italian newspaper, except the two controlled by the premier, and Gaddafi's satrapic follies had for some time been providing, rather stale, material for cartoonists. The rule that secret files must contain only information already known is essential for the operation of a secret service, and not just in this century. Likewise, if you go to a bookshop specializing in esoteric publications, you will see that every new book, on the Holy Grail, the mystery of Rennes-le-Château, the Knights Templar, or the Rosicrucians, repeats exactly what was written in earlier books. This is not simply because occult writers are averse to carrying out new research, nor because they don't know where to go looking for information about the non-existent, but because followers of the occult believe in only what they already know, and in those things that confirm what they have already learned. It is the formula behind the success of Dan Brown. The same happens with secret files. The informant is lazy, and the head of the Secret Service is either lazy or blinkered. He only regards as true what he already recognizes. Given that the secret services, in any country, aren't able to foresee events like the attack on the Twin Towers, in some cases, being regularly led astray, They actually bring them about, and that they file only what is already known. It would be just as well to be rid of them. But in present times, cutting more jobs would indeed be foolish. I have suggested, however, that while in terms of its contents it was a false scandal, in terms of its formal implications, WikiLeaks has opened a new chapter in history. No government in the world will be able to maintain areas of secrecy if it continues to entrust its secret communications and its archives to the internet or other forms of electronic memory, and by this I mean not only the United States but even San Marino or the Principality of Monaco, and perhaps only Andorra will be spared. Let us try to understand the implications of this phenomenon. Once upon a time, in Orwell's day, power could be seen as a big brother who monitored every action of every one of its subjects, particularly when no one was aware of it. The television Big Brother is a poor caricature because everyone can follow what is happening to a small group of exhibitionists, assembled for the very purpose of being seen, and therefore the whole thing is of purely dramatic and psychiatric relevance. But what was just a prophecy in Orwell's time has now actually come true, since the power can follow people's every movement through their mobile telephones, through every transaction, hotel visit, and motorway journey carried out using their credit card, through every supermarket visit followed on closed-circuit television, and so on, so that the citizen has fallen victim to the eye of a vast Big Brother. That, at least, is what we thought until yesterday. But now it has been shown that not even the power's innermost secrets can escape a hacker's monitoring, and therefore the relationship of monitoring ceases to be one-directional and becomes circular. The power spies on every citizen, but every citizen, or at least the hacker appointed as avenger of the citizen, can find out all the secrets of the power. And even though the vast majority of citizens are unable to examine and evaluate the quantity of material that the hacker seizes and makes public, a new rule of journalism is taking shape and is being put into practice at this very moment. Rather than recording the important news, and once upon a time it was governments who decided what items were really important, whether it was declaring war, devaluing a currency, signing a treaty, the press now decides independently what news ought to be important and what news can be kept quiet, even negotiating with the political power, as has happened, over which disclosed secrets to reveal and which to keep quiet. Incidentally, given that all secret reports fomenting government hatred or friendship originate from published articles, or from confidential information given by journalists to embassy officials, the press is coming to assume another purpose. At one time it spied on foreign embassies to find out about secret plots, but now it is the embassies that are spying on the press to find out about events in the public domain. But let us get back to the point. How can a power hold out in the future, when it can no longer keep its own secrets? It is true, as Georg Simmel once said, that every real secret is an empty secret, because an empty secret can never be revealed. And holding an empty secret represents the height of power. It is also true that to know everything about the character of Berlusconi or Merkel is in fact an empty secret, so far as secrets are concerned, because it is material in the public domain. But to reveal that Hillary Clinton's secrets were empty secrets, as WikiLeaks has done, means removing all power from the power. It is clear that countries in the future will no longer be able to hold secret information online. It would be just the same as posting it on a street corner. But it is equally clear that with current surveillance technology there is no point in hoping to carry out confidential transactions by telephone. And nothing is easier, moreover, than to find out where and when a head of state has flown off to meet a colleague. Not to mention those popular jamborees for demonstrators that are the G8 meetings. How then can private and confidential relationships be carried on in future? What reaction might there be to the irresistible triumph of complete openness? I am well aware that for the time being my prediction is science fiction and therefore fanciful, but I cannot help imagining government agents riding discreetly in stagecoaches or calèches along untrackable routes, along the country roads of more desolate areas, and those not blighted by tourism, because tourists use their mobile phones to photograph anything that moves in front of them, carrying only messages committed to memory or, at most, hiding a few essential pieces of written information in the heel of a shoe. It is most appealing to imagine envoys from the Glubbdubdrib embassy meeting the messenger from Lilliput on a lonely street corner, at midnight, murmuring passwords in their brief furtive encounter. Or a pallid Pierrot, during a masked ball at the Ruritanian court, who draws back from time to time to where the candles have left an area of shadow, and takes off his mask, revealing the face of Obama to the Shulamite who, swiftly drawing aside her veil, we discover to be Angela Merkel. And there, between a waltz and polka, the meeting will at last take place, unbeknownst even to Assange, to decide the fate of the euro, or the dollar, or both. All right, let us be serious. It won't happen like that. But in some way or other, something very similar will have to happen. In any event, information, the recording of a secret interview, will then be kept as a single copy or manuscript in a locked drawer. Just think. Ultimately, the attempted espionage at the Watergate complex, which involved forcing open a cupboard and a filing cabinet, was less successful than WikiLeaks. And I recommend this advertisement to Mrs. Clinton. I found it online. Matex Security has been in existence since 1982 to protect your property. With made-to-measure furniture for the home, with secret compartments to hide your valuables and documents, where no intruder will ever find them even if they search your whole house or offices or boats of whatever make or model. These works are carried out in the greatest confidentiality and made to the specifications and instructions of the client, built exclusively by our cabinet maker and our highly dependable staff. Some time ago, I wrote that technology moves like a crayfish, in other words, backwards. Point 1. A century after wireless telegraphy revolutionized communications, the internet has re-established a telegraphy that runs on telephone wires. Videocassettes, which are analog, enabled film buffs to explore a film step by step, moving backward and forward and discovering all the secrets of how it was put together, whereas DVDs, which are digital, allow us only to jump from chapter to chapter, in other words, only by macro leaps. High-speed trains now take us from Milan to Rome in 3 hours, while flying there, all in all, takes at least 3.5. It is not so extraordinary, then, that even politics and government communication techniques should return to the times of the horse-drawn carriage, meetings in the steam room of a Turkish bath, or messages left in an alcove by some Matahari. Reworking of 2 articles that appeared in Liberacion, December 2, 2010, and L'Espresso, December 31, 2010. 1. Edited by Leonard C. Lewin, New York, The Dial Press, 1967. Back. Asterisk. 1. Giacomo Leopardi, L'Infinito, circa 1819, translation by Jonathan Galassi. Back. 2. Eugenio Licaldano, Un'etica senza Dio, Rombari, La Terza, 2006. Back. Asterisk. 1. In Generationes animalis et homines in quibus est forma perfectissima, sunt plurimi formae et generationes intermediae, et per consequens corruptiones, quia generatio unius est corruptio alterius. Anima igitur vegetabilis, quae primo inest, cum embryo vivid vita planti, corrumpitur, et suctit anima perfectior, quae est nutritiva et sensitiva simul, et tunc embryo vivid vita animalis, hac autem corrupta, suctit anima rationalis ab extrinseco imissa, licit precedentes ferent virtutes seminis. Back. Asterisk. 1. For the story of this reply and the justifications that followed it, see Hugo, Elas, by André Gide, edited by Claude Martin, Paris, Editions Fata Morgana, 2002. Back. Asterisk. 2. Jean Cocteau, Le Mystère laïque, in Œuvres Complètes, Volume 10, Lausanne, Miguerat, 1946, page 21. Back. Asterisk. 3. Umberto Eco, Casablanca, o la rinascita degli dei, in dalla periferia dell'impero, Milan. Bompiani, 1977, pp. 138-46. Back. Asterisk. 4. Elogio del Monte Cristo, in Sudli Specchi e altri saggi, Milan. Bompiani, 1985, pp. 147-58. Back. Asterisk. 5. Victor Brombert, Victor Hugo and the Visionary Novel, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1984. Back. Asterisk. 6. Karl Marx, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, translated by Eden and Cedar Paul, 1926. Back. Asterisk. 7. Georg Lukács, The Historical Novel, translated by Hannah and Stanley Mitchell, 1962. Back. Asterisk. 1. Translator's note. The word casino in Italian is in effect 2 words, with 2 pronunciations. A casino, with the accent on the final syllable, is the same as the English casino, or gambling house. But here we are concerned with the other word casino, pronounced, confusingly, with the stress on the penultimate syllable in exactly the same way as the English word. Back. Asterisk. 2. Now that we have established what Veline originally were, I can explain how the word came to take on its present meaning. When Antonio Ricci started the television entertainment show Striscia la Notizia in the 1990s, he wanted some girls, usually appearing on roller skates, to bring messages for the 2 presenters, and he called them Veline. But the choice is very significant. It means that when Ricci created Striscia la Notizia, the fact that he could make a joke out of the word Veline indicated there was still an audience that remembered and knew what the Velines sent out by the Min Colpop were. If no one knows this today, it is another reflection that can be made on noise, on the superimposition of information. In the space of 2 decades, one notion is cancelled out because it has been taken over by the obsessive use of another. Back. Asterisk. 3. Translator's note. Silvio Berlusconi appeared as guest at a girl's 18th birthday party in April 2009, prompting his wife to file for divorce. Back. Asterisk. 1. Translator's note. An imaginary island in Emilio Salgari's novels. Back. Asterisk. 2. Renato Giovanoli, Scienza della Fantascienza, Milan. Bompiani, 1991. Back. Asterisk. 3. According to a recent hypothesis, yet to be proved, tachyons could exist as neutrinos. Back. Asterisk. 4. Hans Horbiger, Glacial Cosmogony, Leipzig. Kaiserslautern Hermann Kaisers, 1913. Back. Asterisk. 5. Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier, Le Maiden des Magiciens, Paris. Gallimard, 1960. The book was translated into English in 1963. Back. Asterisk. 6. In fact, it was Rudolf Elmayer Westenbrug in Die Welteiler nach Hans Horbiger, Leipzig. Kohler Emmeling, 1938. Back. Asterisk. 7. For example, René Allo, Hitler et les Sociétés Secrètes, Paris. Grasset, 1969. Or Giorgio Galli, Hitler e il Nazismo Magico, Milan. Rizzoli, 1989. Back. Asterisk. 8. For example, Gerard Kuiper of the Mount Palomar Observatory, in an article that appeared in Popular Astronomy in 1946, and Willy Ley, who had worked on the V1 in Germany, in his article, Pseudoscience in Naziland, in Astounding Science Fiction Volume 39, 1947. Back. Asterisk. 1. This collage contains passages, in the following order, from Alexandre Dumas, Ponson du Terrail, Giuseppe Garibaldi, Xavier de Montespan, Victor Hugo, Dumas again, and Carolina Invernizio. Back. Asterisk. 1. Translator's note, fascist organizations of workers and employers. Back. Asterisk. 2. Apart from passages that link paragraphs, the various judgments are taken from articles that appeared in the 1920s and 30s, in the following order. 1. Carlo Lonati, Joyce, in Corriere della Sera, August 20, 1925. 2. Report on reading the manuscript of a portrait of the artist as a young man, 1916. 3. Santino Caramella, Anti-Joyce, in Il Baretti, Volume 12, 1926. 4. Valentino Piccoli, Ma Joyce Kai, in L'Illustrazione Italiana, Volume 10, 1927, and Il Romanzo Italiano del Dopoguerra, in Le Parole e il Libro, Volume 4, 1927. 5. Guido Piovin, Narratori, in Le Parole e il Libro, Vols. 9-10, 1927. 6. Curzio Malaparte, Strapaese e Stracita, in Il Selvaggio, Volume 4, Number 20, 1927. 7. G. B. Angioletti, Ora Poetica, in La Fiera Letteraria, July 7, 1920. Curzio Malaparte, Strapaese e Stracita.